lawyer-client relations. My name is Don Hayes. I'm a staff attorney here with the South Royalton Legal Clinic. I work with the Veterans Project, so the Veterans Legal Assistance Project of Vermont. We deal with a lot of veteran-specific issues, but we also deal with issues sort of outside the normal range of issues you might find a veteran seeking. We do bankruptcy representation, we do some family law representation, we also assist veterans with discharge upgrades, applying for VA benefits, things of that nature. I'm also, I do have a private practice in Bethel where I do bankruptcy work and transactional work, real estate transactions and things of that nature. Very happy to be here. The panel today, we're going to be talking about lawyer-client relationships and how trauma impacts those relationships. And depending on the kind of work that you decide to get into, trauma may in fact be something that you're exposed to quite a bit from your clients. So I'm looking forward to our panel discussion today because I think we'll probably all pick up some very useful tools on how to deal with trauma. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel briefly. First up, we're going to have Dr. Marissa Coleman. Marissa Coleman is, good morning, and happy spring to you.
Yeah, thanks.
So unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it down today due to our spring-like weather that we're experiencing outside. It is spring, after all, in Vermont. So Dr. Coleman is a bilingual clinical psychologist. She works with individuals and communities that are impacted by human rights violations, conflict, war, torture, health epidemics, and trauma. She focuses on local capacity building, infrastructure development, culturally grounded approaches to what is considered best practices in the area of mental health and psychological well-being. She is, as we will see, passionate about health and healing. Dr. Coleman earned her doctorate in clinical psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology with a specialty in international psychology and human rights. She got a postdoc fellowship from Emory University School of Medicine and Children's Healthcare in Atlanta. She's a frequent contributor to international conferences and media outlets, and she operates a teletherapy practice for Vermont and Georgia residents. Next up, we have, Dr. Coleman, if you don't mind, I'll just go through the rest of the panel here, and then we'll start your presentation. And I'm looking up at her as if she's looking right back at me, but that's the way technology works, right? Next to me is Irene Kakandis. She's a Dartmouth professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature. She was also a Fulbright Scholar at Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. Excellent, okay. And she had a fellowship with the Sony Corporation and the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial. Her work specializes in narrative theory, trauma theory, cultural studies, and life writing, especially experimental memoir. She has developed a model of circuits of co-witnessing to victims of trauma, whether in a contemporary, historical, or literary context. Immediately to her left, we have Valeria Chambers. Valeria Chambers is the Policy and Research Coordinator at the Transformation Center in Boston, Massachusetts, where she has been since 2005. The Transformation Center is a peer-operated training and support center focused on facilitating growth, well-being, and diverse voices and expressions of people in all stages of recovering their mental health and freedom from addictions and traumatic experiences. She is also a policy advisor for Blacks United in Recovery, which is a statewide advocacy network addressing mental health, trauma, and substance recovery in underserved communities. You have your degree in psychological anthropology from the University of Chicago. It seems like we have a nice contingent of Chicago alum, and a Master of Education from Harvard University. So welcome. Finally, we have a Vermont native, Marcia Webster.
Almost.
Almost? Are you technically still a Flatlander?
I was 4 when I moved to Vermont, so not a Vermonter.
I apologize. Let me redact and correct. We have, just kidding. Marcia Webster grew up in Vermont from the age of 4, to be clear, surrounded by alternative education and a commitment to adult learning. She did study arts and healing at Lesley, earning a master's in expressive arts therapy. She came back to Vermont in 2013 and focused on professional training, learning how to facilitate recovery from overwhelming experiences through somatic, which is body awareness and release. So very happy. This I think is important and a true indication of a Vermonter. She delights in contra dancing and in time with 2- and 4-legged friends and family. So I'd like to welcome the whole panel, and we're going to begin with Dr. Chambers. So I yield the floor to you. Dr. Coleman, I'm sorry. My apologies.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I regret that I'm not able to be with you all in person, but thankful for technology that we can still be connected in this way. The slide regarding goals and objectives. We're going to briefly review the differences between single incident trauma and complex trauma, and then move into discuss common triggers of post-traumatic reactions that you may see in clients that you would work with. And then I'll end with providing some recommendations for reducing your client's risk of re-traumatization via the legal process. Next slide. Single incident trauma occurs as a one-off event. It's one incident, and it's commonly associated with the diagnosis post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. With that said, the current Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM-5, now includes a diagnosis of complex trauma, which is likely what you would see more in terms of client reactions. And so next slide into the complex trauma defined. It describes exposure to multiple traumas. It also refers to impacts of that exposure, and that's a really key component that was missing from previous editions of the DSM. For complex trauma, it's usually interpersonal. It can occur between people, involves being or feeling trapped, and is often planned, extremed, ongoing, and or repeated. So this is chronic exposure to traumatic events. Often has more severe, persistent, and cumulative impacts, and can involve challenges with feelings such as shame, trust, self-esteem issues, identity, and also difficulties in regulating emotions. Then additionally, the use of different coping strategies, including alcohol and drug use, self-harm, over and under eating, as well as overworking. And then finally, it can affect the emotional and physical health, well-being, relationships, and daily functioning of survivors. Next slide. We cannot have a discussion about advocating for survivors of trauma without acknowledging that racial trauma is interwoven into the foundation and fabric of our country, more specifically our legal system. And so I will define racial trauma as it may result from racial harassment, witnessing racial violence, or experiencing institutional racism. The trauma may result in experiencing symptoms of depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, feelings of humiliation, poor concentration, or irritability. I want to take a moment and just point out that oftentimes racial trauma is overlooked. And it can just present as depression or anxiety or many of the other symptoms that are listed here. So that's why I think it's an important thing to take note of. And with that said, some critical training areas, because of time we don't have, it doesn't allow us to go into all of it, but I wanted to list a few critical training areas. If this is something that you would like to learn more about, dive into, then I suggest receiving some training around implicit bias, microaggressions, race in the law, and then post-traumatic slave syndrome. I want to also take note that due to historical and systematic oppression, many communities of color are often distrusting and traumatized by interacting with legal professionals. That is probably something that many of you are familiar. And my hope is that more law schools will continue to weave this content into core curriculum and continue to provide education and training platforms such as this conference, so that students can engage in difficult dialogue and introspection about how we have all been socialized in a race-based system. Next slide. So what is a post-traumatic trigger? It's something that can remind an individual of a negative experience, which is often traumatic, that causes a reaction. And I like to point out that trauma isn't just held in our verbal memory, that our body holds the memories of trauma as well. So all senses may be involved in a trigger response. And I've listed some examples here for sight, a color, location, appearance, or even the sirens can be triggering. In terms of hearing, voice characteristics, loud noises, crashes. A common symptom of traumatic response is hypervigilance. And so you may see that in terms of increased startle responses with clients that you may work with. And then in terms of touch, textures, scarves around the neck, or even unsolicited touches like a hug or a pat on the back can be re-traumatizing for some folks. And then taste, food associated with the offender or to the trauma, and then as well as smells, perfume, cologne, or weather. When working with a trauma survivor, it's often a good idea to not use a lot of perfume or cologne because you don't know if you may be triggering a traumatic response. And so, as I mentioned, trauma is subjective. And so when working with trauma survivors, it's key to remember that, because what may be traumatic for you may not be for your client, and vice versa. So in terms of the importance of practicing empathy. And then also monitoring your own reactions to your client's trauma narratives. So in working closely with trauma survivors, you're going to be hearing their trauma stories and their survival. And so really making sure that you're able to monitor and contain your own reactions so that you can be as supportive to your clients as possible. And then, as I had mentioned, that you can also consider various traumatic triggers. So, for example, challenging yourself to think of potential triggers that clients may work with have experienced throughout their life. Particularly, I in my work, focus a lot on communities of color and advocating for them in many regards, but thinking of the triggers that communities of color may experience as they're going through the legal process or interacting with legal professionals, including police. Next slide. So some important considerations to think of as you're going to be working with trauma survivors, just remembering that traumatic experiences often strip survivors of their sense of control and safety. So really empowering your clients to choose, to make choices that they can within the process. And it could be as simple as choosing where to sit when they're meeting with you, making sure that you're not blocking the door, that they have a clear way out, can actually do wonders in terms of a professional and client relationship. Asking about your client's triggers and taking the time to know and learn what may be particularly difficult for them in your work with them, and also as they progress through the legal system. And then again, this may seem like a common thing, but consent is huge. So, not patting the back or giving a hug without consent and without knowing if that would be triggering to your client. I always like to say and talk a bit about how language is extremely powerful when working with survivors, and using the word survivor versus victim can be incredibly empowering for trauma survivors. And that's something that, all of us can continue to strive to do, to really rewrite the stigma around trauma, and also to take the burden off of the survivor and really empowering them to just walk in their healing. And then I have a note about doing your own work. I can't stress that enough. One, because it's important to monitor your own reactions when working with clients, and especially as they're discussing their trauma narratives. For example, in my work, this shows up quite a bit when I'm working with asylum seekers as they're going through the legal process of when they're sharing their stories of survival. There may be characteristics or parts of that experience that are not common for many of us to hear. So monitoring reactions, so there's not a, that must have been horrible, or that's terrible, because we don't know how they're defining that or how they're experiencing that themselves. And so we don't want to input our own reactions and our own thoughts on them. And then also, I can't stress enough that knowing your own implicit biases. All of us have them, and it's part of the work that we all should do in terms of being socially minded citizens, but also advocates in whatever role that we may be in, is knowing the biases that we may hold so that we don't cause harm on our clients willingly or unwillingly. With that said, again, not assuming that a survivor wants pity or sympathy, and making sure that you're knowing the difference between an empathic response versus showing sympathy. There's a really great short animated video from Dr. Brene Brown regarding the differences between sympathy and empathy, and I usually love to show it if we had more time than I would, but if you ever wanted to look it up, you could simply just YouTube it, and it really is phenomenal. Next slide. How to enhance safety. I touched on this a little bit, but being thoughtful about how to create an environment that feels safe and secure. So thinking about as much as you can within your control. Lighting in your office, again, allowing your client to sit by the door, and then preparing your client on what to expect. For many people, it can be a very daunting process to be involved with the legal system and very retriggering and re-traumatizing. So letting them know exactly what to expect when they walk into your place of meeting, or what the building can look like, or will there be a security guard at the front? Will they be asked to give belongings and go through a metal detector? Those kinds of things that some of us may not think much of will be really important for your clients and survivors of trauma to be told ahead of time so that they can appropriately prepare themselves. And then refer to a trauma-focused mental health provider. It is so crucial to survivors of trauma to have a therapist or psychologist to walk through this process with them so that they can process their own reactions before and after different legal hearings and meetings. Next slide. Then I'll just end with additional resources. Again, this PowerPoint will be available for all of you after the conference, but there's some readings that can be really helpful and provide an introduction to some of the themes that I've discussed, such as working through implicit bias, understanding microaggressions, and also understanding the experiences of communities of color that might be involved with the legal system. Just increase cultural understanding and humility. And then my final slide, my information. I welcome any questions after all of the panelists speak, but if there's anything that you would like to ask me, feel free to email me and I will be available. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. And as Dr. Coleman mentioned, we will have questions at the end of the session. So if you think of a question you would like to ask any of the panelists, hang on to it, write it down, put it in your phone, whatever you need to do to remember it, and we'll get to the question at the end of the panel. So next up, okay. So next up, Irene.
So I can use this, is that right?
I believe so, but if not, I'm more than capable to press buttons.
Okay.
My wife reminds me.
Great. A couple of prelims, that seems to be my style. First of all, a huge thank you to everyone who put this together, especially to Allison, who met me a few months ago and came right up and said, some students here were thinking about doing something like this, and it's been really meaningful to connect with all of you. This is my first time on the campus, even though I've lived in the Upper Valley for 25 years, and it's really great, and it's wonderful to see Paula, whom I also met quite a few years ago, but we'll leave the exact number of years aside. And Paula set me up really well for the things that I want to say. I also just want to highlight, though, that we're doing something very interdisciplinary by having me up here, because I'm neither a mental health professional nor a lawyer. So I appreciate the gesture of inviting someone with a PhD in comparative literature to speak to all of you. But how I plug into the idea of lawyer-client will be pretty different from some of the other talks. Finally, just one specific thing before I get to my goals for this, one specific thing about trauma that those of us who have been working in this field know, but we sometimes forget to say, which is not just that there's a casual meaning of trauma and there's a very specific meaning of trauma, but also the word itself in English refers to both the cause and the result, and we don't have that many words that are like that. So it is, I would imagine, when you are speaking with your colleagues or clients, it's important to keep that in mind. This is picking up on Dr. Coleman also about the importance of language. So specifically my goals now, and I'll have to move along with them very, very quickly. I wanted you to hear about this concept of co-witnessing that I developed, which I did develop from psychotherapy and specifically from my work on the Holocaust. And I want to try to make a bridge between that theoretical work that I did and some of the ways I'm thinking about the current refugee crisis. Okay, and then at the end, I guess we'll have some kind of discussion. So here, to start with the definition, since we have so little time, the way I define co-witnessing as involving emotional and verbal assistance to the traumatized that enables somehow the story of their traumas to be articulated. Because I do work with historical material, we actually can have historical co-witnessing where the victim or witness is no longer alive, and one has to research and deduce the story and then hopefully pass it on. In terms of this term that I developed, I want you to notice the co, and I very much want you to notice the hyphen, because this, for me, signals that it is not my trauma, even though I might be the one who's talking about it. And I think that's a respectful and necessary gesture in this kind of work. So why did I develop this concept? This is the part that a literary scholar can't skip over, but it's the least interesting to you, so I'll sort of go fast. I came across a novel, a short novel by a poet, actually, that was written in 1930s Berlin. And it's a very, very upsetting short story about a woman whose daughter disappears, and she finds the daughter many, many days later, and she's been raped and she's barely alive. And it talks about the anti-Semitic climate in Berlin, the misogynistic climate, et cetera. And I thought, what is going on here, right? This is the author. Her name was Gertrude Kolmar, and she was removed from her home in the early 30s by the Nazis and then deported to Auschwitz, where she died, was murdered in 1943. So in reading this, I suspected trauma, but I needed to understand what did that mean and what did it mean for me as a reader and a teacher of this text. So eventually I found myself trying to forge a link between trauma theory and reading theory. So here's my link, and I know this slide looks a little dense, sorry about that. But in communication theory, we talk very much about a speaker who has some kind of message, and that ends up with the listener. This has been revised quite a bit, and that's relevant to my work because the arrows actually go in both directions. And what someone says is very influenced by who's listening, right? So, but using that model, which we also use for reading text, right? So some author creates some text and some reader reads it. We think about the idea of electrical circuits. That's the metaphor, right? And I'm not an electrician either, so those of you who know more about electricity than I do can correct everything I'm saying. But the idea would be that when one piece of the circuit is disrupted in some way, the circuit itself is not flowing. So my idea, taking my cue from psychotherapy, was to somehow reconnect the circuit and to think about what did it take for the circuit to get reconnected, and you see some of the names. Now, when we read, if you think about it for a second, you have the story, right? So there might be trauma in the story, but you also have the text that's functioning also to communicate something. And then you have the stories people tell about the text, right? So my model actually involved several different concentric circles. So just to circle back quickly to Kolmar and what was going on in her text, we had this inner circle where this child, both because of her age and because of what happened to her, can't seem to testify to herself, right? So that's the scenario of trauma. But then those who are closest to her, including her mother, who is victimized in her own way by this society that she lives in, can't really testify for the child. And then you have things going on at the textual level, like repetition, right? Or ellipses, where things are missing altogether, like the rape of the child is missing from the story, or inability to put the right name on what happened. And this is something that, as readers, we could then witness too, theoretically. Only here's the historical thing, is no one witnessed to it in the time that it was written because the text wasn't published. So why wasn't it published in 1932? The Nazis weren't in power yet. Why does it take the sister who inherits the manuscript until 1965? Why does she call it a mother instead of a Jewish mother? You see what I'm talking about, right? So that outer circuit is us. And that outer circuit I call transhistorical, transcultural co-witnessing. So, can this co-witnessing do anything, right? It can't help Gertrude Kolmar, the author. She's long dead. It can't help her character because, after all, she's, right, fictional. We don't want to forget that part, okay? But several smart thinkers I rely on to say, yes, it does matter, because what we do with it can right, in some sense, an historical wrong. We can say, like we do with slavery, that was wrong, and our society does not condone that it happened, okay? So that's the importance of this gesture. So very quickly, a few other theorists. I don't want you to think that all of this comes from me. A beautiful theorist of gender difference and sexuality, Eve Sedgwick, no longer with us, unfortunately, talked about the importance of making the difference between identifying with someone and identifying as someone, right? And there are a lot of examples of identifying as, and you can see, I hope, very quickly the disrespect in that. My dear friend Marianne Hirsch, who used to live around here, she's at Columbia now, came up with the term post-memory. This immediately made sense to me. This has to do with generational difference, right? So the trauma happened to your parents, but somehow you experience that because of all the stories that you've been told, because of the witness that you had to be to your parents' trauma. This is a really complicated, wonderful term that's taken off like wildfire, but we don't have time to talk about it more. I hope you can see the connection to co-witnessing, to post-memory, also with the term witness by adoption. Marianne Hirsch, by the way, used as her first example, the example that triggered, so to speak, the concept from Spiegelman's Mouse. If you don't know this text, I very strongly recommend it. I wanted to show you this slide because this is the artist protagonist in the text, Art Spiegelman, Artie, he's called in the text. And you can see, I think, that this kind of operation takes a lot of work. It doesn't just happen, right? So this is another aspect that I normally would be able to talk about more. In thinking about Marianne's work, I came up with a term I felt was missing, which was this idea of the post-memory gap. It relates to the theme I have of it's as if I were that person, but I am not that person, so it is not about me, right? And we have to be very self-conscious about this gap, and I hope you can see that application for the legal profession. From literature, so fictional texts, I found myself moving without design, really, to nonfiction, to documentary film, and to current events. So I want to show you one example of how I hooked up something related to the Holocaust to contemporary events. I'm a addicted reader of the New York Times. I saw this article, as you can see, quite a while ago. It's never left me. And it was about the woman on the right, a very wonderful professional pianist in South Africa. After her mother died, she felt like the piano that her mother had owned and she had played was telling her something. That's her mother on the left with her fiance, a non-Jew. The mother actually was from a Jewish background, which the daughter had no idea about, okay? And so the daughter started doing research, and these are some of the things that she found out. And my point about this is that the piano becomes a method for the daughter to learn about the mother and then to decide to do something about it. But first she has to uncover the story. So how does she honor her mother? She co-witnesses by telling this story to the press in South Africa. As you see, it ended up in the New York Times. But she actually also sends the piano back to Berlin, right, which is where it had come from. So it went from Berlin to South Africa when her mother fled Berlin, then sent by her back to Berlin, where it sits in the Jewish Museum in the city of Berlin. But before she sent the piano off, she played a concert, and I find it very, very moving that the last thing she did, remember this is the early 2000s, was to play the new national South African anthem, which I know you all know enough about South Africa to understand what that meant, okay? So she was hooking up the prejudice that had been levied against her mother with prejudices in the society and violences, not just prejudice, with something that was part of her world. Okay, here are some other texts that are incredibly important to me. Some of you might know that Patrick Modiano, a French writer, actually won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. This is a very mysterious, important book that functioned in some of the ways a Jewish mother did. But here's what I hope I can offer you the most. Even though I'd been working with this concept, as I was reading through Modiano, I kept noticing how often he uses the word I think, right? And the mysterious one below, right? But he also was using statements about not knowing. And this seemed really important to me, that he was marking what he could never know about this other person's situation, right? Completely different scholar, also French by coincidence, Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, who in a very early essay that to my knowledge has never been talked about very much except by me, comes up with this idea of the prochain, of the neighbor. And the part I want you to notice is, he says, you don't have a prochain. You do something to yourself to make yourself the prochain of someone else. So we know about the worldwide refugee crisis. I hope we are living it very intensely here in Vermont. This made me think again about my concept of co-witnessing and could I do anything with it. But just to recoup that concept, you look back at things have already happened to understand how prejudice, violence, et cetera, works, okay? And then you look forward or register your own environment so that you can understand what the similarities are, and the part I have underlined, to develop a repertoire. So whether it's a repertoire of things you might be saying with clients or it's a repertoire of public action that you might be taking, right? So this becomes very important to me. It's the only way that the idea of never again means anything to me, is if we do something with what we've learned from the past. So I want to show you this guy, Michael Reber. He's Swiss, and this is what happened to him. He and his wife were just vacationing in Athens. They went to Victoria Square in Athens. This is summer of 2015, and he saw all these people, especially young children, sitting there hungry. What did he and his wife do? They went to the nearest grocery store, they bought groceries, they went back to the square, they distributed the groceries, and repeat and repeat and repeat until the wife needs to go back to Switzerland to get more money. They followed the refugee flow, which I don't have time to go into, but I hope you remember went from Syria through Turkey, across the Aegean to the Greek islands, and eventually to the Macedonian border. This is where this photo is from. As you know, unfortunately, the Europeans decided to close the borders, and many refugees were caught in Greece, and the Greek government is completely broke. So this organization started to go into the camps, and these camps were set up by the military in Greece, which has very, very little money. What I want you to tell you about their relief effort was specifically that the first thing they did whenever they arrived on the scene was listen. They went to people, they went to family units, and they said, what's your story? what could we do for you? What do you need the most? And based on what people were telling them, they then took actions like setting up a women's center, setting up a school, distributing food by appointment times instead of people waiting in a line. I hope everyone gets the idea. Okay, so this is the name that they're using now. They're still in Greece. And this is my fuller definition of co-witnessing. I want to emphasize again that you have to decide that you want to think about someone else first, and then you have to do a very special kind of listening that doesn't involve appropriation, but does involve respecting and passing on stories, whether it's in a court of law or not. And I do want to mention that I'm dedicating this slide to all those people who are trying to help refugees wherever. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kakandis. That was a really interesting perspective, and I think something we can certainly all use in our attorney-client relationships. So thank you. So next up, Marcia. And
They're doing together, I think.
yes, I believe so.
Should we move down a little bit? So
We can.
you going to stand, or would you like to? We can move down.
I was going to sit next to Valeria.
Perfect.
You guys are okay, thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm Valeria Chambers. I work at the Transformation Center, where I am the Research and Policy Coordinator. I'd like to do two things this morning. Share about the Transformation Center's work in mental health peer support, advocacy, and systems change, and focus on our work in the Black community that points to ways that you, as our advocates and allies, can support us in the important work that you're doing. The Transformation Center grew out of the civil rights movement. We are people with lived experience of mental health conditions, diagnosis, and extreme emotional states. When we disclose a mental health condition, there's high cost. There can be inaccurate assumptions, judgments made based on one's diagnosis, language, income, class, or even your type of insurance. We can lose relationships, jobs, even our children if we disclose to the wrong person. However, at the Transformation Center, we do disclose. And we use our experiences to bring about a world that supports recovery and healing. We have a vision for trauma-informed communities, and our Central Mass Recovery Learning Community is highlighted by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration for this work, as you can see. Let me tell you a bit about my story. I had no idea that I was a trauma survivor. I had pushed away and pressed down childhood memories. But after college, I began having a lot of depression. But still, I was getting, good grades. I was able to do my work. There was no clue that anything was wrong. But stressor after stressor continued until one day I realized I was walking around kind of frozen, numb. It wasn't that I was, weepy or upset about, but I realized I could not find my feelings. It took me years of therapy before my therapist was really able to convince me that I needed to be assessed. My own family had no idea I was depressed or that I had PTSD. And in fact, some psychiatrists that I encountered said, well, you can't pinpoint the exact event and the exact person. So you have all these symptoms that people have mentioned, but we can't call that PTSD because you don't have these identifying factors. So that experience is something that I see so much in my community, where people have kind of shut down and are not able to access crucial information, feelings, thoughts, memories that are really important. Two people from Blacks United in Recovery put it this way: I would rather stay in pain than go to a mental health clinic. Another said, people fear us and justify murdering us because they are afraid. They still don't realize that they are the originators of this horrible story. Another said, it's not right for someone to have to endure trauma for the cause of liberation, and then have someone else say, but we really need you in there doing this work. In other words, kind of suck it up. The role of allies, advocates, people without mental health diagnoses who are not Black or African American is crucial. It is why we work with mental health disparities researchers like Dr. Ben Cook and Dr. Margarita Alegria from Harvard University, and why I come to places like this and share my story. The Transformation Center works hard to bring about trauma-informed mental health services. We have found that these systems don't change easily. We have taken to heart the motto, nothing about us without us, from research to policy to practice. One strategy that we use is our Certified Peer Specialist program. We train and certify people with lived experience to provide peer support within healthcare settings. These CPSs are bringing about change every day. You can see here from this chart that when a CPS is working within a treatment setting, people are far more likely to stay with the service because they are heard. They are supported by someone who is also working hard in their ongoing recovery process. Certified peer specialists help mental health staff and professionals in positions of authority, like attorneys and law enforcement. They help to reverse subtle or not so subtle messages about the status or value of the person who needs help. We know that identity matters, but it matters even more for people of color. Identification with race, culture, or their non-English language provides an important protective measure that can be a much-needed source of personal and communal self-esteem that holds great meaning. If this is not explored, welcomed, and understood by people who seek to help, so much that could be used to build connection and understanding in client-lawyer communications could be erased or violated within systems that are built on powering over and lack cultural responsiveness. One small but significant example of this is the title of our panel. Now, while I realize we're at a law school speaking primarily to folks working in legal professions, a way to reduce the implicit power differential here would be to instead say client-lawyer relations. The subtle messages given via language used and/or environment can make or break a working relationship with clients. At the Transformation Center, we're working with affinity groups to bring forward the identity-specific voices of many cultures. At the same time, we realize we must learn to receive these groups in ways that will truly welcome them and allow them to be who they are. One person said, it really should be cultural humility and cultural responsiveness, not cultural competence. Because cultural competence implies, I read a book, I took a course, and now I know how to do you. We notice that disparities are not going away and that new solutions are needed. So dismantling racism and oppression on all levels and creating true access to culturally responsive mental health care and fair legal representation is really about system-wide change. In conclusion, trauma must be taken into account as we work to create solutions. Our work and the work of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study demonstrate that peer support around trauma and trauma-informed services is essential. Current systems continue to identify healthcare and mental health care disparities. However, we are looking at how systems can invest in new solutions because the old ones are reinforcing disparity. In this regard, we are building understanding among allies and stakeholders and advocates that Black communities are creating solutions to invest in things that are really working. As you work in legal and healthcare settings, please consider using the Certified Peer Specialist role as a way to establish positive working relationships, reduce harm, and learn more from the people who've been there. Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That was awesome. And now, Marcia.
Hey, how's everyone doing? It's wonderful to see so many people here. So my name is Marcia Webster, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator at the Transformation Center. So I am also a Certified Peer Specialist. I have a pretty diverse background in mental health, policy, and peer support. And I guess I want to sort of slow down and, no, slides are fine. I don't have any slides. And just check in with how many people here are working with clients. You have some role in the legal system or some other provider system, and you're here to understand more about the people you're working with. Like, is that kind of a pressing question for people, for some people? How many students are here from, yeah, excellent, great. You didn't have to drive far, I guess. Okay. So I'll start, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. Trauma is, the whole definition of trauma is experience that is overwhelming, life-threatening, and impossible to get your head around. That is the nature of being overwhelmed by an experience. And it's so interesting and important to understand that horrific experiences, live on in the body, right? But even generational trauma, medical experiences, developmental trauma, when you don't get quite enough of what you need growing up, it really lays a groundwork for living in a state of fear, fight, flight, or shutdown. So that's really, in our mental health peer support movement, we really assume that all of us have some kind of experience of being overwhelmed, disempowered, not understood. So that's really what the peer support role gets at a very intuitive, lived experience level is, when I'm walking into a room, ER or a doctor's office, and we're out more and more in jails and prisons. The peer support movement has moved into jails and prisons as well. We really land and meet people with a hat on saying, I've been here too. I have some kind of shared experience of being labeled, convicted, locked up, something. And it, in terms of sort of treatment and healing, that's what we really know in the peer support movement, is that the most horrifying, scary, and damaging place to be is alone. If you're in the world with nobody caring, understanding, or present with you, our system is going to be in either fight, flight, which can be kind of scary for the other person, or shut down. And as Valeria said, you can look pretty good and get along in the world pretty well if you're shut down. But that's actually even a more extreme state in terms of the physiology of trauma. So that's really kind of the thing that the peer support movement has learned, is to really take seriously what people say about their own experience. I can't understand what you're saying. We now know that the ears, the head, the eyes, the skin of someone in a traumatized state really are not taking in new information. That's not a choice, that's just the physiology. So our peer movement really is about just being with each other and not trying to figure it out, but the co-witnessing concept is really helpful. So that's the kind of experience I had when I was hospitalized and got locked up and medicated, and a lot of it was my just going along. Who wants to argue with the authority, right? But it's terrifying and isolating, and I'm sure that I don't have a lot of experience in the legal world. When someone's in trouble and has broken the law, they're not going to be starting from a place of feeling safe, connected, and understood. So just right out of the gate, that's something to know about who's with you. So I guess what I want to say about the peer support movement and the work I've done since joining the Transformation Center in 2006 in Massachusetts, I've really gotten very curious about my own seemingly, nonsensical traumatic responses. And I've learned about somatic experiencing, which is a body-based way of understanding our survival responses. And when those survival responses of fighting, running, or playing dead, if we don't come back fully from them, as wild animals do, if we're confined and not able to shake and wiggle and yell and express ourselves to come back to safety, it's like the cows. I love that slide. A cow that's confined and prevented from doing its natural thing when a wolf attacks its brother is going to get stuck in trauma. And, the next time something happens that even looks a little bit like that, they're going to be right back there. So that's how a lot of us live, right? So one of the good friends to the peer support movement that I want to mention is Stephen Porges. He's a scientist. He developed something called the polyvagal theory. And I'm sorry, this isn't written down anywhere. I didn't know if it would come up. But he kind of cut through all the distinctions we tend to make about what is an anxiety disorder, what is depression, what is schizophrenia, all these little micro silos of diagnoses. And just from a pure scientific perspective, he got to the truth that we have these 3 ways to survive. Our nervous systems do what they do because we're mammals. And it shows up, not being able to hear well shows up in a lot of diagnoses, including PTSD, anxiety, all sorts of things. So Stephen Porges did a lot of great basic science on trauma that's helpful to us now. And again, the peer support movement just naturally gets that being able to socially engage, to hear someone's voice and feel comforted, to have someone look you in the eye in a way that's not overwhelming and taking over your story, just allows our breath to deepen and our body to relax. So a lot of the value of the peer support movement is being able to go directly from our own experience of what is safe enough. I don't like the bright lights. I don't like the sound of the heat system behind me. things like that, that seem so small. You know, buck up, get used to it. But now we know, and it's been validated, that these sensory and environmental cues, or a face that's looking you really flat because they're not supposed to influence you, that's dangerous. You know, we don't do well in a world where people aren't, you know, mirroring and responding and being warm and caring. So, so having to really rethink a lot of our institutions. Hopefully we'll do that anyway. So I wanted to say just something brief about these resources. So the Transformation Center on top here, our logo's covered by a picture there. So we're based in Massachusetts, and we have a lot of stuff on our website about changing the mental health system and honoring lived experience and supporting and training people to walk into traditional organizations and provide peer support, despite the stigma. And then there are some Vermont organizations that are important to know about. The Vermont Psychiatric Survivors Organization has offices in Rutland and Brattleboro. So unfortunately, I don't know them well. I live here in Sharon. But they're out there, and they have a brand new executive director that looks super dynamic. There's also a lot of substance use peer support in Vermont and around the world, including the Turning Point in Wilder, peer support, addiction drop-in groups, very welcoming, and one in Burlington, the Turning Point Center in Burlington. The Vermont Recovery Network is a statewide organization that will also get you to a lot of other turning points around the state. And they help people find recovery coaches, which is sort of the addiction parallel to peer support workers, mental health, substance use, just standing there side by side. The VA has an amazing vet-to-vet program as well that I would highly encourage. I don't know how much, Paula, you guys work with the vet-to-vet program. Again, the informal, you walk in, there's a couch, coffee, no rules, you know, no big chairs, just like people. And two national organizations I mean, there's so many, but the Alternatives to Violence Project is, I think, international, and there are a lot of chapters. I actually don't know if there's a Vermont chapter, but they come out of the prison system, and it's a really peer-to-peer way of people being where they are, speaking their truth, and being accepted, just through games and fun. And there's a national listing of peer support respites, so places people can stay overnight that are not medical model, diagnosing, kind of trying to tell you what to do to be okay, a real peer-to-peer environment as well. So I think I've said enough. You're free to ask questions, and I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. So I believe if somebody can, how much time do we have for questions?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, great. So open the floor up to any questions. Obviously, a great panel, a lot of ground covered, some great perspectives to bring to our practice. Any questions out there?
First and foremost, thank you for taking time to come down to Vermont Law School and giving your expertise in so many different areas. So I have quite a few questions, but I'll stick to two. And I'll try to shorten them best as possible. So my first question, I guess, will go towards Dr. Coleman and really anybody that wants to answer. But so when you find yourself in instances, so for myself, I would like to practice environmental law. I would like to do some type of focus on environmental justice litigation and advocating for environmental justice communities. So when you were speaking about racial trauma and you were sharing your personal stories as well, I could, definitely know that I've seen that in communities that I've been involved in. And so my question is, so when you're working in these communities of color or low-income communities, oftentimes the people within those communities are unaware that they suffer from these traumatic instances, as you mentioned personally. Either it's, racial trauma or some form of PTSD. A lot of times in these communities of color, the conversation of mental health is not something that people are comfortable having, or it doesn't happen at all, to be quite frank. And so my question is, how do you navigate? So when you're an attorney heading into a community that has to deal with, opening water bottles every morning to take baths in regards to like Flint, Michigan, or in regards of North Carolina, and the hog farming there, stepping outside and smelling, all the type of hazardous waste and toxins and things of that nature every morning. To me, that's a trigger that they suffer just from waking up. And so my question is, how do you navigate with a client when you see and you notice signs of racial trauma or PTSD, when they themselves may not notice or realize it? And then what do you do when it is a community of people and not just a singular person, but an actual community or town or a city or region where they are all suffering from the same kind of trauma and maybe unawareness of where this trauma necessarily builds from and how to deal with it? That'd be my first question. If
great.
I can start there.
Okay.
Okay.
A great question. I appreciate that question a lot, actually, and I want to make sure that I'm fully understanding it. So if I don't answer it fully, please let me know. I would say that in terms of my work, I do a lot of psychoeducation. So a lot of education around and validating experiences. So when I'm working with communities of color or an individual of color, then and they're describing symptoms that they have struggled with throughout their lives, I oftentimes can help through psychoeducation to put a name to it. And so it's not uncommon that somebody, will come in and I'll work with them and they will be describing this sense of shame they felt all of their life, or a sense of low self-esteem, or symptoms of anxiety when they're going in and out of different communities, or feelings of depression. And really it shows up a lot in terms of the sense of hopelessness and foreshortened future. And so I will talk to them about, any experiences they've had that they would identify first as traumatic, making sure not to impose my own belief on them, and then providing a lot of names around racial trauma, systematic oppression. And oftentimes I see just like a lightening of a burden, like a lifting of this burden of, oh, that's what it's called. That is what I've experienced. And so it can be a really validating experience. I know that you also asked a bit about communities when working with communities that may not necessarily identify it as traumatic. Again, there are many times where I do trainings in communities where I've seen that, and it really the same is held true, that helping individuals kind of have language to what they're experiencing and what their lived experience was can be incredibly empowering and liberating, and making sure that they are empowered to use their own language and assign their own meaning to those experiences. So if oftentimes I'll ask, would you consider this traumatic? Or is there another term or another word that you would like to use? Would you like to say it was just a difficult experience, or it was unpleasant? And then we go with that in the work that I do.
That's great. And one, if I can offer from an attorney's perspective, and I know other panelists may have an opinion on this as well, but I often focus on, I don't offer a solution until I understand the problem. So a client may be saying a lot of things to you, and as attorneys, we immediately think, well, what's the legal remedy? How can I help this person legally? But it's very important to not start offering the solution until you've taken the time to listen to the problem. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks so much for that excellent 3 or 4 part question. In our work with Blacks United in Recovery and with the mental health researchers that we've been working with, we discovered that, one particular neighborhood of Boston, high emotional and mental health need, but almost no usage in terms of mental health services. But when we looked harder, we discovered that the community was coming up with their own healing system. They've created, a church there has created something called Can We Talk? And they have every Thursday night, you know, you arrive to like a Sunday-style home-cooked meal. It's free. There's no signing in. There's no, you can share your name or not. You don't pay. You get serenaded by a saxophone and a yummy dessert. And then every Thursday of the month is a different theme, and it's all around trauma. One Thursday night would be Afro flow yoga and journaling. You know, another would be a men's trauma group. And they have Black and Latin men coming to trauma groups, which I have never seen in a clinical setting. You know, like dozens of them. Then their signature program is Can We Talk? And they do it open mic style. They have, you know, set up tables like this. They have a microphone up front. There's a little serenade by the saxophonist. And one by one, people are just invited to come forward, and they share their stories. Just story after story, however you want to put it, whatever you want to say. And they have what they call community companions, which are their versions of peer supporters, people who have experienced really difficult trauma. The whole program came in, out of inner city violence, but it now encompasses any type of violence. And people can be paired with these community companions and allowed to kind of figure out how to get back on track. And they have a mental health professional there who's available if needed to give referral or one-on-one. So things like that do exist. And the other thing I would say is to keep listening, asking questions, and also never underestimate the power of sharing a bit of yourself. And I know in the legal profession that's a very delicate line there, but you can learn what things you can share, and even that little bit can encourage someone else to do the same.
So I'd like to respond briefly also to say two things. One is about what Dr. Coleman mentioned about offering people terms that might actually fit. That's how it was with me with post-memory. When my colleague, Marianne Hirsch, told me what she meant by post-memory, I just had a rush of them coming back to me because I grew up in that kind of situation. So giving terminology can sometimes help, but I also want to emphasize and share what you just said, because we need to, the solutions need to be so various. So the more examples we can share with each other, the better chance we might be in a position to share a model that would actually be appropriate for a specific community. So I loved what you just shared about this church finding this solution that fit their community. That's why I told you about the Swiss guy in Greece, you know? He saw a problem and he came up with a solution that it didn't help everybody. There are still hundreds of thousands of refugees. There are actually millions right now. We're heading towards 80 million people. This is the largest number of people displaced from their homes in the history of the entire world, to our knowledge. So we can't just have one solution, but if we share the solutions we've heard about and what worked about it and what didn't, then we have a repertoire in our head both about what we might do ourselves to speak to injustice or violence, but also what models we could share with individuals and communities for solutions, right?
That's great. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say thank you all. It's been a great panel. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. We are here for solutions, aren't we? I'm trying to help myself too, I must tell you. How difficult is it to create an environment where everyone feel included? And I'm looking from it from a diversity point of view. Culture, gender, sexual orientation, and all of that. How difficult is it, and why is it so difficult? Oh my, it's very difficult. I told you I'm trying to help myself.
As it turns out, this session is going to go until approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon, so take it away, panel.
Yeah, just give me a little hint or something.
Could I just go back to that listening and respect? Okay,
Yes,
there has to be a complete intolerance for lack of respect. The institution or the community has to say, you cannot disrespect the people who are here. I mean, I think that's just such a basic thing, and at Dartmouth we struggle with this all the time. But we are struggling. We are in that fight to label it when it happens and say, that's not who we are. That's what I told you about this co-witnessing thing, right? When people are already dead, you can't help them, but you can help your community say, that's not right. We don't accept that. And I think we're making some progress in sexual violence, for example.
So I can describe a group I'm part of in Massachusetts, a statewide policy and advocacy group that's been meeting since 2003 every month. Started with a 3-year grant, and then the group just has kept meeting for all those years. It's called Transcom. And we spend so much time going, really? Is it really like that for you? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So sometimes the disrespect, to have the courage to be able to say, you say that and you think you're talking about all of us, but it actually doesn't really fit for me. And so a lot of it really is just taking the time and being curious and not being so quick to get to the solution. At Transcom, a lot of the coming together has been around peer support in the mental health realm and in the substance use realm, and they have such different histories. Mental health profession comes out of oppression. We need to sit and control these dangerous people who are hurting us, and we're going to send them away, and we're going to medicate them. And we're the professionals, and we found some things that work. The addiction treatment movement came out of peer support. And people with addictions eventually said, okay, people that don't have their own addiction story might be helpful to us, and we'll let you have degrees and be our counselors too. Really different histories. That's, broad strokes. And so at Transcom, and then we have some racial diversity, and we're just now starting to really make safe space to hear about some of what that's like. And the hard part is there isn't an easy, quick answer. And it's fascinating. We've got young adults finally saying, well, actually, we don't want to be supervised by people over 30. Like, you guys totally don't get it. And that feels a little disrespectful to some of us, right? Wait a minute. But there's something there, like people really are, our inclination is to survive and do a good job and be respectful. So if you can slow things down enough to get to that, it's going to be there. So I think, that is the most efficient way, even though it takes so much time.
Yeah. Another thing that we've done is affinity ally work, where you meet with your own group to really kind of go over your own stories, your own issues, your own concerns, in a space that's totally safe because you're with your group, quote unquote. But then the ally group are people who really feel a connection. Something about that affinity group just, touches your heart. You're like, I really admire what they're doing, what they're trying to do. I want to learn from them how I can help them based on what they say they need, not on what I come up with but what they say I can do to help.
Could I jump in there just because I want to name another dead person, which is, I want to bring to mind Toni Cade Bambara. Do you guys know this amazing African-American author? I had the privilege of hearing her in 1995 when she came to Dartmouth for a conference called Women in Books. That can sound really innocuous, but it was all about political activism by writers, quote unquote, from minority groups. And she said something about SNCC and what was going on in the Black Power movement that really stuck with me my whole life, which was, don't assume you know who your allies are. Don't assume that just because they have this group characteristic that they're your allies. She said, and this comes back to the dean's point too, people come together when they have something in common, when they're trying to get to a common goal. And when you find that you have a common goal, you can make a true alliance, right? So I think it works in the negative sense and the positive sense, right? Not assuming we're not going to understand each other because we have gray hair and we're over 30. It can be generational, it can be professional, non-professional, it can be across racial lines, it can be across gender lines, but there should be a purpose, right? And respect for the common goal that we share. So that's not from me, that's from her, and I have a lifelong mission to pass that on. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That's. Oh.
She doesn't know we're looking at her.
Oh, okay.
Oh, are you pointing to me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I didn't know, I want to be mindful of time, and I can't see all the dynamics in the room. But one of the things, I'm just thankful for that question, and I'll just answer it really quick, give my 2 cents really quickly, is that until we start to look at the inherent segregation within the communities that we are all a part of, likely these things are going to continue to perpetuate. So I come from a standpoint of really needing to do some internal work and look at implicit bias and the microaggressions within the communities and build those allyships. But until we can actually make it plain and call it what it is, like whether it's racism, sexism, all the isms and the discrimination that exists, then it still is going to, the privilege that can be inherent in some of the dynamics and relationships that communities of color find themselves in will continue to perpetuate themselves. So I have a lot more to say about that, but I know that we have a lot of time. I just can't stress enough to all do our own work. And if we're looking to change our communities, then let's start with our own personal lives. Are we reaching across borders, seen or unseen? Are we incorporating in our own personal lives deep connections and relationships with people that come from different backgrounds and experiences than ours?
And so one kind of final thought, and I think we're at the point where we're running out of time, unfortunately, but as attorneys, as future attorneys, one thing I think that's really important is to not commoditize compassion. So when lawyers tend to operate on a billable hour type model, and it sometimes makes us impatient, and you can't, if you're trying to develop an understanding of, victimization, or you're trying to understand things from your client's perspective, you can't do it on a clock. You can't do it when you're watching your billable hours. So just keep in mind, that we can't commoditize our ability to be compassionate. Well, I think that's it. We're going to have to wrap up so we can get some food in us. It was a great panel discussion. I'd like to give a nice thank you to all our panelists today for presenting. And I believe you guys are hanging around, with the exception of the doctor, of course. You guys are hanging around for lunch, so if folks have questions, please feel free to approach. So thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.